He's one of the most controversial thinkers on the planet.
I met Richard in London, and I got a phone call, and he said, Josh, I'm here in the lobby of your hotel. Do you want to come down and have dinner?
Biologist, controversialist, world-famous atheist.
Why are you an atheist?
Why don't you believe in Thor? Why don't you believe in Zeus?
Richard Dawkins inspired millions by popularizing evolutionary biology, but his work on religion and morality has become a lightning rod for controversy.
We finished up, and we were about to part ways, and he says to me, he's like, okay, Josh, but you know, we are going to attack religion a lot. You're okay with that, right? And I said, oh yeah, I was all in on it.
I despise religion.
My name is Josh Timonen, and I grew up in a suburb, Hillsborough, outside of Portland. I started a rock band when I was about 17 or 18, and we recorded a couple albums, and we started touring, went all across the country. And I was sitting in the back seat, and I looked over, and he had this book in the back called The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. And I asked him, I go, what is this? And he goes, your mom probably wouldn't want you to read it. Of course, that made me want to read it. so immediately I had to get this book and read it. In The Selfish Gene, Richard talks about a gene-centered worldview where the gene is the mechanism, the thing that is being reproduced through time, and that there is nothing more driving life than natural selection on genes. In the book, he very clearly says that if this is true, then God is unnecessary, and that we can explain the natural world simply through this mechanism. And at the time, I was very persuaded by this, that if this is true, then it undercuts God. It undercuts the idea of creation and the beauty of creation, that this could simply have been a process through natural means to get to where we are today. There was a desire for an atheistic worldview that I think encouraged me to pull me that way, based on just wanting a secular life, wanting less restriction. I was, introduced to drinking and having fun, and these were all things that were like a finger on the scale of the decision-making of whether or not I was actually going to shed my faith and become an atheist. Once I decided I was an atheist, it changed my worldview perspective in many ways. I didn't think there was an afterlife. I thought this was it. There was kind of a bleak future for everybody, in my mind. That's a tough pill to swallow. And to go from a much bigger picture of the world to a much smaller felt terrible. I was living in LA in 2006. I was doing odd computer jobs. I was playing in a band, recording albums, and I had just watched the Root of All Evil documentary that Richard Dawkins created, and he talked about eradicating the world of religion, that this was a dangerous idea. Atheists will say that because you can't argue with religion, that you can't persuade them, it's a dangerous force in the world. We have to eradicate their ideas before we can actually interact with them in a civilized society. In a twisted way, I thought of this as something to benefit humanity, that I should help him eradicate religion from the world. After I watched it, I tried to go find his website, and he didn't have one. So I sent Richard an email, and I said, hey, you don't have a website, would you like me to make one for you? And he wrote back and he said, yeah. I said, okay, yeah, let's do it. I was all in on it, I was very excited to be a part of this. He had seen we had some video chops, me and my wife, so we started doing little video projects. I went on a trip with him to the Galapagos, and we filmed for a couple weeks there. Here I am, sitting on a rock on an island, filming a video of Richard Dawkins explaining iguanas and how they evolved on the islands. As an atheist and an evolutionist, this was a big deal. This was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. While promoting atheism and working for Richard Dawkins, there were a lot of times where it was very exciting. There was a lot to do, and I kept very busy. And a lot of times you're doing things that you felt were impressive. There was a lot of people who wanted my job. At the same time, we were meeting a lot of people, some famous people. There were definitely glimpses of emptiness in all of it. There were glimpses of people who were not satisfied with their life. At one conference, I was filming, and Sam Harris gave a talk about spirituality. The crowd at the atheist convention was having none of it. They could not stand that he would even inject the idea of something, let's say, transcendent. And I remember talking to my now wife after that talk, and I thought, what's wrong with people? Like, he was saying the most lukewarm thing here about spirituality, but everybody just shut him down. It bothered me that nobody was open to that. There was such an attachment to a physical materialist worldview. The materialist worldview means I'm only going to accept things that are within the natural world, and I'm going to exclude anything spiritual or that I cannot explain with natural laws. I think the atheist worldview has a lot to do with control. It's about controlling the walls of your sandbox. To say, if I keep everything within these walls, then I'm safe. And I can understand it, I can explain it, and that's it. One of the most terrifying times in my life was the birth of my daughter. She was born 2 pounds, about 8 weeks early, and survived by the skin of her teeth. My daughter had several surgeries. During the surgery, they take the baby into the operating room and they put the parents in a room called the butterfly room. And they call it that because butterflies live for a day. They're preparing you for the very real possibility that this may have been it. This may have been the entire time that you had with your child. If there was ever a time that I would have wanted to pray, it was in there. I was an atheist. I wasn't praying to anyone. I remember thinking in that moment, this is the most valuable thing in the world to me. And it was one of those big thorns in my mind of like, but I'm an atheist. Just another creature like me. Just another creature that's gonna die like me. What's it matter? The atheistic worldview can easily discount the value of a human. And I remember wrestling with that and thinking, but this is everything. It just felt wrong. It was a moment of realizing that the worldviews were not connecting. Then 2020 happened.
Tear gas is fired back. Federal agents emerge in their dozens.
We moved to Portland, Oregon, in the center of all of the chaos. We had 100 days of riots in Portland. We had mom and pop shops that I visited in downtown that just one night, they're just gone. So it was heartbreaking to see the city falling apart. This was an area that I went to work every day. So I knew the streets very well. We would be driving down a street and you would just see a mob of kids, essentially, just shutting down traffic. You're thinking, this just isn't right. What's going on here? The police were overwhelmed, and really what it came down to was that they were arresting some people in the city for their actions, but then they let them out the next day. So there were zero consequences for anybody wreaking havoc in Portland. And as I was watching all of this, I would have conversations with my peers, people I worked with or friends in the area, and many of them would defend the rioting and say, well, it's for a good cause, or it's for justice. The people who are doing this think that they are doing good, and yet they have no moral compass. And it got me thinking a lot about that moral compass. Where's it coming from? I thought I aligned with these people who were defending the riots, and I didn't. I thought, well, wait a minute. I thought we were the good guys. And realizing, why are you defending what's clearly violence and destruction and desecrating our city? Another thing we were seeing all through 2020 were the measures being taken to control other people's behavior. Whenever somebody's trying to control somebody else in this way, that's evil to me. And to see not just the big institutions, but the individuals, it was your neighbors trying to police each other, that really shocked me. And it felt like there was a wave of evil that had come over everyone. I always think of it like an ocean wave where the individual particles are all being pushed in the same way. I also noticed that there was this upswell of satanic imagery in the world. So you would see, okay, evil's obviously rising on all these different fronts, and then at the same time people are celebrating Satanism, claiming that it's all just in good fun. Is this working together? Is this not just a coincidence? How many coincidences am I going to allow before I say maybe there's something else at work here? Maybe there are forces that aren't natural. That was the moment that I felt that the supernatural needed to be considered. So me and my wife started looking at other places to live. We moved to Texas near the end of 2020, and we showed up and didn't know what to expect. You realize things are different. You go into a coffee shop and they're playing Christian music. You go anywhere and people are speaking about church, they're speaking about God. We made the decision to homeschool my daughter. And we were atheist homeschoolers. We decided we were going to teach her at home and figure out some way to socialize her in the world outside. And we saw a cowboy church close to our house. And my wife and I both kind of joked and said, what's that about? Do you do church out in the arena? And we had no idea what to expect, but we went and visited this church. And it was the first church that I stepped foot in 20 years. My wife and I both kind of chuckled to each other saying, can you believe it? We stepped foot in a church and kind of expected to catch on fire or something. We went home that day and I remember us just talking about it, well, what do you think about that? Is this something we want to do? Do we believe this? How can you just go to church if you don't believe? And we went really as atheists for a while. We just thought, well, let's just go. Let's see what it's like. Really, we were after the cultural benefits. We saw the fruit. We saw that people treated each other better. There was more respect. And I think that all goes back to the idea of the soul. I think it took a big, massive, chaotic experience in our life, like 2020, for us to open the door of our worldview. I noticed that a lot of the people who were standing up against the tyranny were Christians and were churches. And I started to put those pieces together about that firm foundation they talk about, that Jesus spoke of, that if you don't have a firm foundation, the world has a much easier time of pushing you around. If you had asked me when I worked for Richard Dawkins what I thought of Jesus, I would have said I didn't think he existed, that I thought he was a myth. And I set about digging into, first of all, can the gospel accounts be trusted? Did Jesus exist? And can we trust what people said about his life? And then you have to wrestle with, is he who he says he is? And through reading, some big books for me were Cold Case Christianity, The Case for Christ, really dove into being able to trust the accounts of the Gospels, to understand that they were written early and not hundreds of years later. The most important event in the Gospels is the death and resurrection of Jesus. There were hundreds of eyewitnesses over many different events of the resurrection that are accounted for in the Gospels and the letters of Paul. So when you cumulatively look at how many people witnessed the resurrection, then it becomes very compelling. And it's very hard to find an explanation other than that he did rise from the dead. Any other explanation falls flat. That if it was a story that was concocted, makes no sense when many of these eyewitnesses went to brutal deaths, still proclaiming that Jesus rose from the dead. There's plenty of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I didn't want to give up my atheist worldview. It's very comforting to feel like I control this sandbox of ideas of the natural world and I'm going to stay here. But at the same time, I felt that Jesus did live and that he did rise from the dead. I remember that moment of saying in my heart, yes, this is true. And if it's true, I have to grapple with his words, and I have to grapple with what he's telling me through the scripture. He's telling me why he was crucified and why he was resurrected, that it's to pay for sin. He says, repent and follow me. So from that moment on, I did rededicate myself to following Jesus and to using any skill that I had to help undo some of the damage I might have done through those years. Jesus shows us that death is not the end. His resurrection shows that he conquered death. There is no one else in the world who has conquered death. Following Jesus is not just a fire insurance policy for eternity. It is absolutely making your life better now. I can't tell you how my life has changed since I started to follow Jesus. It's been incredible to see what God has done for me in the last few years, and I'm just standing back and watching. Jesus says he is the way, the truth, and the life. And so do not delegate what you think about Jesus to somebody else. Do the work yourself and dig into it. Read everything you can, study everything you can. You have a responsibility to yourself to fully understand who Jesus is. You have to decide what you do with Jesus.